All right, Matthew Pines, how are you, man?
I'm doing wonderful.
I see a gift in front of us.
Courtesy of BPI.
Where's the first third?
You know,
American Huddle's been here.
The folks at the Nashville Gun Club were thirsty.
You know, this is my favorite drink.
Well, it's for you.
Do you want me to pour? Do you want to pour?
Be my guest.
Wow, thank you.
I was telling Matthew about the American Huddle story.
Well, he finished it.
He finished about half a bottle and then recorded a podcast. And it's the drunkest podcast we've ever done.
I love American Huddle, but he stole my Blantons. Danny, you in? That's a yes.
I'll have a tiny bit.
That's a yes.
Thank you, sir.
Well, there's a few people watching who will be disapproving, but here we go. All right, Mr. Pines, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
I made a show recently with Brandon Quittem looking at fourth turning stuff. And cheers, by the way. Cheers, Danny.
Cheers.
Let's go back a step. From birth up until about 10 years ago, life was like pretty normal. I always felt all like the big things in history were behind us. And I know we had things like 9/11 and global financial crisis, but like world wars and end of world crazy shit was always like the stuff I thought was in history. You know, all those threats were gone. And then over the last certainly even 7-8 years, I've started to become increasingly both aware and concerned of a growing number of things which I feel are kind of like potentially existential for humans, to the point of considering a little bit of prepping, but without wanting to sound like some crazy guy in the films who's preparing his guns and his tins pineapples out the back of his house. But the things I have kids, I've got concerns. I'm concerned about the financial system. I'm concerned about war at the moment. I'm concerned about the negative sides of AI. There's a number of things that are kind of converging at the same time. And I'm like, I don't know where we will be in 5 to 10 years. Genuinely don't know where we will be. And I want to be hopeful and optimistic, and I want to be part of the positive side. But equally, I'm like, there's a lot of crazy shit going on right now.
You're right. You're right.
Well, at least we got whiskey.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that, right. I don't really know where to start. I mean, look, Bitcoin and money, we know well. We've covered this, and we will cover this today. I think the war stuff at the moment, I'm particularly concerned about. And the bit that I'm particularly concerned about is, if you go and look historically, World War I and World War II, is how those conflicts grew from a singular kind of issue to growing regional to World War. And you can see these things, these pockets of activity and these allegiances forming. And that's very concerning for me.
Yeah, I think we're facing, a new period of global disorder. And we've had, a number of these characteristic periods throughout human history. Oftentimes historians debate, what are the endogenous or exogenous factors that lead to that disorder. And usually when you have a stable system and you disorder it, usually it decays past a certain limit and then breaks. And then there's usually crisis, conflict, devaluation of currencies, a whole bunch of disruptions to the social and political economic fabric. And then there's reconstitution out of that. But these are not like deterministic systems, right? So people look at those historical templates and sort of, automatically reapply those to our present circumstances. And I think that's appropriate because all you can go on is our historical examples. But I think, this time may be different in some fundamental ways, and thinking through, okay, on the geopolitical side, just to sort of zoom into that particular domain, we have a sort of a balance of power dynamic that is reticent of those previous eras that led to global conflict, right? You have a status quo power, the United States, the West more broadly, kind of NATO plus is the sort of lingo to refer to kind of an arrangement of, Western liberal hegemonic military and economic powers that has sort of dominated the post-war era. We have now a rising set of challengers. The awkward cringe name is CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that sort of dominate mostly the commodities, sort of natural resources and manufacturing of the Eurasian heartland, and are increasingly looking to challenge kind of the Western liberal system. So that's geopolitical sort of state of affairs. And the United States and sort of this Western system hasn't really ever confronted a challenger or a set of challengers with the military and economic heft and technological capacity. And they're not just natural producers of commodities, but in the case of China, are aggressively climbing value chains and aggressively, taking the mantle of strategic technology domains. And so this competition, unlike maybe in the past where it was purely almost like imperial systems fighting over colonies in Africa, now it's a global conflict over not just the future structure of international trade and geopolitical and military arrangements, but almost like what is the predicate of human civilization itself? Human civilization right now essentially is digital civilization. We all live, our lives, our societies, our economies are fundamentally mediated through and on, digital networks. And so there's a network competition playing out, right, over what is going to be and whose values are going to dominate the digital systems that are going to, run our lives for the rest of the century. And so this takes on a whole different dimension, not just traditional militaries and fighting over natural resources and coups and that sort of thing that dominated the 20th century, but things around like this sort of techno-authoritarian stack and what sorts of value systems are going to emerge around the world, whether they're mediated by Chinese, Huawei, ZTE, 5G surveillance and central bank digital currencies, or whether there's an alternative that the world will turn to. But in this current moment, where you essentially have a number of flashpoints around this kind of periphery. So we have Eurasian sort of autocratic challengers in a kind of techno-industrial and security bloc. Increasingly seeing examples of that, not just sort of arms sales between Russia and North Korea, but also agreements on help for their ICBM and missile program. China also, providing essentially raw components for drones and other munitions for Russia. But, this frames a kind of a competition between East and West, if you want to, crudely, define it that way, but is premised on these flashpoints. And so there's flashpoints in particular in Eastern Europe that obviously has turned into a conflict, an outright proxy war that has potentially existential stakes. Back in October of 22, there's credible concern. The CIA did an assessment of like 50% chance that maybe Putin would use a tactical nuke. So uncomfortably close to that type of scenario. And then, of course, you have the Middle East, a perennial flashpoint risk that also threatens to pull in great powers. But if you go sort of around that arc from the North Sea, where we've had cable cuts to, for example, the Svalbard cable, that basically is the major downlink for most internet sort of satellite communications. It was cut all the way down through Eastern Europe, through the Middle East, into the India, China, and Pakistan border. That's a perennial flashpoint between nuclear powers, into the South China Sea, where you have armed Coast Guard boats attacking of the Chinese Coast Guard attacking sort of resupply missions by the Philippines, and led to a Philippine sailor losing his finger, and the U.S. essentially making the statement that our mutual defense treaty of the Philippines with the Philippines extends to this rusted hulk of a boat called the Sierra Madre at the Second Thomas Shoal. So there's a conflict, flashpoint risk where the U.S. and Chinese navies could come into conflict over this rusting hulk of a boat in the South China Sea, all the way up to, of course, Taiwan, which is, of course, the flashpoint that everyone's probably focused on the most, and then but including the Senkaku Islands with Japan, all the way up now to the Northern Sea route, which because of climate change is now becoming a major source of commodity trade between Russia and China. So there's this global dynamic playing out. So any given flashpoint takes a lot of attention in the news, but they're all basically determined by and driven by this larger conflict between these two systems that are now really fighting for global supremacy. So that was maybe the TLDR.
Okay, so really we have a challenger to the global world order, which is the authoritarian, Chinese-led authoritarian. I
mean, so you could view it that way in the sense of the way that some folks in the West have framed it as, and this might be like an ideological it's sort of motivated to sort of shift the perception of the conflict between essentially democracies and autocracies, right? But if I just zoom out as putting my pure objective analyst hat on, the post-war system was constructed essentially as you might call it a softer form of imperial sort of colonization, right? All systems of sort of hegemonic power ultimately want to dominate as much of the world system as possible, right? That sort of is the natural imperative of any power structure. And that's what the United States basically did. We sort of built a world order. We had, we had to deal with the Soviet bloc, and after we defeated that bloc, the the mentality that went into like the neoconservatives was one of essentially a view of the world as the core versus the gap. And this was a famous argument like the 90s that sort of motivated a lot of the policies of the Bush administration, but also informed a lot of like the liberal internationalism of Clinton, of both Clintons. And this premise was that essentially the core is this matrix of law, of sort of a rules-based system, of sort of relatively free markets, technological innovation, commitment to constitutional republic kinds of political systems. And then there was the gap. And they had this view of history, the famous Fukuyama end of history idea. But in this sort of more realistic context, they saw this essentially as like an inevitable project of just closing the gap. And there were gaps around the world that they had a project to close, right? Whether it was in Libya, in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan, that these were projects that the global hegemon would close. Russia had been defeated. China at that point, we thought would sort of follow the same trajectory of like Germany and Japan as kind of this industrializing, lower cost outsourcing population that then we could sort of invest in and convert to sort of our, convert into our system. They would become essentially a participant in the rules-based international order. They would be a rule follower, not a rule giver. And so in that vision, it was sort of a totalizing vision of kind of, liberal hegemony, kind of dominating the world. The major populations kind of fell under this rubric where, US led system. And there were these like little gaps that we had to close. And I think the realization of the past 10, 15 years was that was fundamentally flawed, that there isn't, a core and a gap, that there are essentially massive gaps, and there actually isn't a dominant world system, right? There are essentially fractures that have already taken place, and what we're struggling with is how to maintain some semblance of a globalized, interconnected economy that grew up in an era where you had that sort of hegemonic power, right? Because you could then do, multinationals could go out into China, could go into Russia, could go across the world and set up McDonald's and auto factories, et cetera. And from the perspective of global capitalism, like that was an ideal sort of state of affairs. And so it's very hard for like the mental models of those leaders and executives to sort of reckon with the fact that world is broken, is not coming back. And now they're, trying to accommodate themselves for the possibility of conflict itself, escalating between great powers. We haven't had to deal with that until, 2022.
But the escalation we could see, in its full form is a different kind of global conflict than we've ever had before because of the nature of nuclear proliferation, the different technologies we have now, a globally connected world, growth in AI. There isn't really... I'm not a historian, but World War I and World War II were essentially power games. Who had the most power and who had the biggest army and who could sustain the most damage, and ultimately it was a kind of game of attrition. But now we have a world where we can have ultimate destruction. I think it's 72 minutes. I understand nuclear war would last.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, 72 minutes. There's a really good podcast that Rogan just did recently with an expert on nuclear war, and she said a nuclear conflict would take 72 minutes.
Yeah, Annie Jacobson.
Yeah, and half the world would be destroyed. And so we're in a different scenario now where there really is no winner if you have a fully formed World War III. So how does that change? How does that change the game theory of this between the US and Russia, China, in that there is no incentive to go to full war because it's a lose-lose?
Yeah, and actually, back when I was doing consulting for the government, I participated in an exercise that involved a nuclear launch. And so I was there, and a part of the exercise is they walked through that TikTok. And it's terrifying, the missile threat.
What does that
conference.
mean? What is that kind of game that you play?
So, anytime a missile is launched anywhere in the world, we have sensors that pick it up, right?
Yeah.
Those are well known now. And that triggers a whole, series of things. It's immediately assessed whether it's, like a Scud or an intermediate range missile, not likely to be nuclear, but obviously if it comes from a known site of ICBMs, then a whole bunch of other things get triggered. Calls automatically get triggered, and then there's a whole series of decisions that get made up the chain to the president, ultimately who is responsible for making decision. And he's got pre-selected options.
What are those options?
I don't think I can talk about this.
Okay.
They're not good. None of them are good options.
So none of them are like trying to intercept anything. They're like a retaliation.
Well, it depends on the scenario, right? I mean, one of the more concerning scenarios is, a rogue state or a rogue actor within a state that, does a first strike out of the blue, right? And, we have a ballistic missile defense system. It is, its specific accuracy is classified. They've published certain, measures that show that it's maybe decent. For maybe like, a small strike, maybe gives you good odds. But there's been, from like a strategic adversary, right, for Russia and China in particular. So North Korea is maybe like one special case where maybe have a chance. Russia and China, though, have systems that there's no chance to stop it, right? BMD, ballistic missile defense is just not gonna work, especially because China has been testing something called FOBS, the fractional orbital bombardment system. Essentially, they launch a system into low Earth orbit, so it can go around the ecliptic, and then they can deorbit it kind of at their will, and then it's got a maneuverable reentry vehicle, so they can take it to wherever they want to go. So unlike an ICBM, which is in a ballistic trajectory, and so you can pick it up, and then you can automatically calculate your interceptors to go hit it. And usually, it's like you send a lot to try to hit one. A FOB system, you're not going to hit it. And yeah, so nuclear war is not great. And everyone recognizes it would be bad for everybody. But there's been, I think, a change in the strategic balance from the Cold War. The Cold War, we reached a point after a number of near misses where we recognized it was insane. And so we signed a bunch of arms treaties and reduced our stockpiles, agreed to certain, like sort of hotlines to deconflict things, and, kind of dialed back the chance of nuclear war.
Is this like the red phone to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We set it up by treaty. And actually, as part of that treaty, just to preview the next conversation, we're obligated to report, identification of unknown objects to ensure that we don't accidentally launch. That's written to the treaty. And so, yeah, they've been on here trigger. The problem is now China is becoming, strategically equal to a certain extent with the United States and Russia. They're not there yet, but they're aggressively developing their nuclear weapons program. Crash, developing, I think, another 500 to 800 warheads in the next few years. And also deploying, novel systems like the FOB system to challenge our traditional defense systems and our traditional doctrines of deterrence. And so, yeah, there's a bit of instability now. And when you had like two major nuclear powers, they could kind of, talk. Now you have three major nuclear powers and then North Korea. And that creates, an unstable or a potentially more unstable deterrence regime. And we don't have the same sorts of deconfliction, red phones with China. So there is this risk of you could see this escalation ladder that starts with, say, a Philippine resupply boat tries to get to, the Sierra Madre, Rusted Hulk, where they have a few sailors kind of permanently stationed there to claim this, basically this little speck of land in the South China Sea. China claims that as their own, part of their 9-dash line. And they've been aggressively trying to, test the limits of the mutual defense treaty that we have with the Philippines, including ramming boats, in this case, hacking people's fingers off. If we decide to escort, say, the next resupply mission, and China challenges that resupply, are we going to fire on a Chinese boat? If we do, besides warning shots, if we hit and we kill a PLA sailor or a Coast Guardsman, well, what's China's reaction? Do they deploy their fleet? Do we deploy our fleet? And now you've got a standoff between two, the most powerful sort of militaries in the world in the South China Sea. Who's going to back down, right? And then you can imagine lots of bad scenarios escalating from there. The scenario that concerned a lot of policymakers in Ukraine was Putin's sort of, use of nuclear blackmail successfully, apparently. Biden told a bunch of donors essentially, is a 50-50 shot he's going to use it. So it's kind of terrifying, one, that he was telling that to donors, at a fundraiser. But also it's indicative of the fact that, policymakers were debating at the time, and this has been reported now, what the U.S. response would be, right? If he uses a tactical nuke on the battlefield, if he uses it like a demonstration, I believe the message that we sent, this has been reported, was essentially we would respond with overwhelming conventional force, on Russia's military capacity in and around Ukraine to essentially, end the war on favorable terms for Ukraine. And that would be the message we would send to Putin. And then we got Xi to sort of also to send a similar message to Putin that use of nukes would sort of abrogate the strategic partnership that they had. So that
because China did kind of break from their tradition of backing Russia. Xi was pretty adamant to Putin that this was not acceptable.
I mean, they're best buddies. Like, they call each other on their birthdays. They've met each other more than I think any other leader have met, another leader. And they dress the same sometimes when they meet up. But like, she's also has an interest in strategic stability and does not want the seal of nuclear use to be broken. Yeah. So, he has a threshold, and the use of nukes was above his threshold.
Just on the testing of each other's kind of capabilities, response times, etc. There was an article came in the news last week, which I was discussing with my son, with regards to US bombers were escorted away from, because they were heading towards Russian airspace. They were escorted away by Russian fighter jets. This is a continual program of testing response times. This is essentially gathering data, right? Russia does the same.
You see them do it around like the UK, don't you?
Yeah, they do.
They send subs in and stuff. And
they've been doing it around the UK, well, a lot of Europe. Essentially, they're all testing each other's capabilities.
Yeah, constantly. Yeah, they're constantly probing each other. This is just the state of affairs. It happens across all domains. And yeah, I mean, that's been able to be managed. So there was no risks of accidents. Everyone kind of understands that's kind of part of the game. What I think is changing now is because great power conflict, direct peer-to-peer great power conflict, is perceived as so existential and so expensive, even if it's not existential, there's an immense incentive to kind of avoid triggering that sort of runaway dynamic. But then what it does, though, is it shifts the sort of domain of competition and conflict kind of to the boundary areas, where you see an intensifying set of conflicts and sort of sub-rosa activities taking place, essentially in space, in the undersea, in the Arctic, and in cyberspace, and in proxies, and in weak and failed states. So as the global competition and conflict dynamic heats up, you see both the risk of this escalation to great power conflict rise, but also because the disincentives to, keep climbing that escalation ladder are so strong, but the desire to kind of shiv someone in the back or, give a jab underneath the surface is extremely strong as well. You get all these destabilizing activities that aren't necessarily so obvious to the layman, right? You see more cable cuts, you see more anti-satellite disruptions and, provocative and aggressive tests of new capabilities. You see much more complex and aggressive threat environment in cyberspace in particular. You see what we've seen throughout the 20th century is proxy wars and coups in failed states. And, unfortunately, the global South is often a victim of these great power conflicts. And that's where we're living in, right? And so that creates a more of a unstable environment for everybody else, right? Because everybody has to live in a world that relies on satellite communications and undersea cables, has to rely on, maritime, free trade. But when you have an environment where, nation states are actively contesting those what were formerly seen as safe commons, whether space infrastructure, undersea infrastructure, or maritime transportation infrastructure, now those are all heavily contested, and the collateral effects on everybody else are very high. Like, of course, the Houthis essentially have been successfully maintaining a maritime blockade for 6 months now, and now all that traffic essentially is being rerouted. And Maersk expects that to basically be the new normal. So everyone's going to have to just pay more for shipping indefinitely, and that gets factored into everything else. And that's kind of a unprecedented sort of case study of the world's most powerful navy. Like, the premise of the U.S. Navy is we guard the world shipping, we make the world free for commerce, and we have been manifestly failing to do that in the Middle East
because of the Houthis or because of
the
Iran?
Houthis. Well, the Houthis essentially is an arm of Iran, giving them those capabilities and giving them the ISR, and our coalition being unwilling or unable to kind of successfully stop that.
Do you know the analogy I always have for this? It's like, in football where two players square up.
Yeah.
but they can't really punch each other because they get sent off.
They're never going to.
So they kind of just like stand, or they do the thing where they put their heads together, but
they don't headbutt.
They can't headbutt because they headbutt, you'll be sent off. So they touch heads, or they stand, and eventually someone loses it and does punch someone, headbutt somebody, and they're sent off.
Yeah,
it's essentially this. They're pushing heads together.
Yeah, and there's, of course, the military loves creating acronyms, and so the acronym they've created this is called ICAD, especially for China's activities. They call it illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. So the sort of nexus of activities that concern the military are those activities that are sort of just below the threshold of war, right? They're not necessarily going to trigger a kinetic response by the U.S. military, but they are shaping the strategic environment in a way that's very disfavorable to the U.S. And the problem in the United States is we don't really have a sense of grand strategy and the deployment of multiple different sets of our national tools to counter those types of activities. We have U.S. military, which is supposed to fight and win wars. We have the CIA, which was to spy and do covert action. We have Treasury Department, which does sanctions enforcement, financial surveillance. We have all these separate bureaucratic silos that have specific tools. They're pretty powerful tools, and they can deploy them where necessary. But our adversaries have sort of learned to adapt to those tools and sort of find that sort of gray space where they can sort of shape an environment in a way that sort of leaves us a bit flat-footed. So up until this point, China's like, okay, like we can just kind of keep doing this sort of salami slicing, inch. And the U.S. government doesn't really have this kind of concept of, might call geoeconomic statecraft, right? To think about, how to challenge that across different domains. You're seeing this competition play out increasingly now that's focused on technology in particular, right? So the geopolitics used to dominate in terms of geography and trade, but increasingly, the competition is seen over who's going to dominate both the current sort of near-term industrial technologies like renewable energy, electric vehicles, solar panels, et cetera, as well as sort of digital systems, cloud computing, et cetera. And then the next generation, science and technology domains. So AI, space, new materials, quantum information, and new energy sources. That's really where the strategic energy of competition is going to be between, especially the sort of NATO plus and China with their allies. And that's a dynamic that's going to increase. All these things are essentially increasingly draw more of the private sector and civil society into those conflicts, right? When it's geopolitics, most people think it's over there. It happens in some third world country. It's a war on CNN. I get it, it's a headline and then it fades away with something else. Increasingly, we're seeing those spillovers and the collateral consequences, become more and more of an impact on Western civilization, Western society, and multinational companies that have to figure out how to work in this environment.
How much do we understand about what the end goal is for these key players? My limited understanding is that the US wants stability under its vision of the world, which is democracy, the dollar hegemony, their form of global order. How much do we understand about what China specifically wants and what Russia specifically wants? And does everyone just want to have, do we think that China would be happy in a world where we have two superpowers, or does China want to become the superpower?
I mean, this is probably the most actively contested kind of policy debate. And depending on which side you fall on, it sort of informs whether you're seen as more of a China accommodationist or a China dealer or a China hawk, right? Because if you think that China fundamentally, and when we say China, I really refer to this Communist Party, right, as like the central stakeholder actor that you're trying to model. Like China is a very complex society, economy, lots of powerful companies, but the people that control the military, the intelligence services, and most of the relevant systems that you're trying to model, like what are those plans and intentions? And I think there's two different, strong interpretations, and I think they interact in a complex way. One is like the view that looks at China as a strategic civilization that has 2,000 plus years of history and a sense of destiny and historical grievances that they want to redress from the Opium Wars, century of humiliation, et cetera. And they see kind of the last 100 years as like an aberration And this is essentially just a natural readjustment to a rightful balance of the global order, where China is perceived as a great power, among equals with the United States. And that with that recognition comes essentially the old imperial kind of tribute system, where most of Asia essentially was a tributary, system underneath, the Middle Kingdom. And, there's kind of that imperial DNA that informs some of their strategic thinking. There's another set of analysis that looks at the CCP as like, you might call like a very sophisticated, kind of capitalist mafia, right? Like CCP Inc., right? Where they control huge amounts of capital, very powerful state-owned enterprises and other proxy enterprises around the world. And they are wedded to an intelligence and military capacity that they can use to fulfill their own kind of CCP Inc. objectives, right? And those objectives aren't necessarily for the grandeur of China per se as a nation state, but for the power of the individuals that helm this party structure. That is a sort of a novel type of institution. Like the CCP isn't the CCP of Mao, right? The CCP is essentially this fused hybrid of global capital, right? Like a lot of CCP like wealth isn't in China. It's trillions of dollars held in, offshore accounts and through proxies and, the complex web, the international sort of dollar system, which they've successfully kind of exploited for the past 20, 30 years. And so you think about it that way, it's kind of like thinking more about the global competition between competing mafias, right? Like, you could, not to say the US is a mafia, but like we clearly have an oligarchy. The oligarchy doesn't necessarily control the whole power structure, but like we do have an oligarchy, right? We've had it since maybe the Robbenberg era. And there's always been like a push and a pull between the interests of that kind of oligarchy, which, flirted with fascism, in the early 20th century. And, the folks that were around at the start of World War II were kind of like, we need to kind of stop Germany, but we also, fundamentally are really quick to do a deal with Germany, with the Nazis particularly, right? So the CIA basically helped export, thousands of German Nazis because they were the ones with all the rocket secrets and nuclear secrets. And we helped basically build the BND, or what is now the BND, but the West German Intelligence Service. We took the former Nazi, we basically helped create the West German Intelligence Service. So we have these like legacy sort of more less visible systems of power, right? We have systems of power you can model as like nation states. And most traditional international relations models the competition on the world stage between countries. Formal governments with national leaders, with militaries and intelligence services, and published national plans and strategies, as well as like classified capabilities and war plans and covert action strategies. But then there are other systems of power in the world that sometimes align with, but sometimes don't align with the traditional kind of Westphalian state concept. And I think like my model of the world is that there were always those sorts of non-state actors, but an increasingly important phenomenon that we have to take into account when we think about the future of geopolitical conflict or technological competition is the emergence of very powerful non-state actors. Right, folks and systems of folks, right? Whether it's private companies, whether it's sort of mafia groups, right? That have huge amount of power, right? Like transnational criminal organizations effectively run a lot of countries in South America and Central America, right? You could argue that Russia is essentially was a sort of a version of a mafia state that kind of did a deal with a legacy state. CCP, you can imagine, was a legacy sort of Marxist-Leninist system that kind of evolved into a mafia, right? But like a sophisticated mafia that was controlling trillions of dollars of capital and globe-spanning state-owned enterprises. And then you have that dynamic coupled with the fact that you have the rise of disruptive technologies, like AI in particular, but there'll be more coming. And then the decreasing cost curve for those disruptive technologies. So right now, the crucible of the Ukraine war is resulting in immense innovation in lethal autonomous weapon systems, what they call laws, to the point where right now, basically, you can mass produce killer drones for $20. Essentially, a $10 drone platform with a $10 landmine that you just strap to it. And there's like these terrifying videos coming out of the battlefield of these, poor grunts on the front line, basically being hunted down in their trenches. And some of them are just committing suicide before they get hit by the drone because the fragmentation grenade, might not kill them so quickly. And so it's creating like a terrifying environment on the front lines of these, autonomous killer drone systems. And okay, you think that's localized to Ukraine, but that capability has now been generated at an extremely low cost. And where's it going to go next? right? Who's going to, every next conflict, everyone around the world, from Turkey, Azerbaijan, to China, to us, to, every paramilitary in Africa is going to go, I want that. So there's going to be a massive demand now to proliferate the mass production of these autonomous weapon systems. And who's going to stop that? I don't think anyone's going to stop that. So I think what you're going to see in the next conflicts to come are going to be those sorts of videos, but in all of these proxy conflicts.
Within the US, strategically, how are decisions being made? Because within China, it's pretty obvious. We have the Xi and the Communist Party. It's very centralized power, a very centralized power structure. There's no challenge to that power structure, so they're able to play this obvious long game. But within the US, we have, don't mean to offend you as a visiting Brit, but you have quite a chaotic political system at the moment. You have a current president. We don't even know how much he's running the country, who's just stood down. We have a new potential Democrat leader who arguably hasn't been through a democratic process. We have a leader of the Republican Party, the nominee for the Republican Party, who has his own questionable background. Like where's the consistency of decision making and long-term strategic position coming from? Because it feels like within the US it could change within an administration, or is it behind the corridors of power behind this kind of clown show that we're seeing? Is that quite consistent?
I think. And I haven't seen behind every curtain,
but
every curtain that I've been able to look behind, I haven't seen like a semblance of like a coherent plan, right? It's just a different curtain with people who are confused and overwhelmed. And I think, people look at the US democratic system such as it is, and, look at it in two ways. One is like it's chaotic, discombobulated, short-term oriented, cannot do long-term strategic thinking, and it's having its lunch eaten by a bunch of essentially dictators that can play the long game and corrupt our system from within. And there's elements of that are true. I mean, one of the disadvantages of democracy is it's hard to get consistency and long-term thinking. It's messy, but it's a little bit more self-corrective, and it's hard to have bad decisions that don't get corrected, right? Because if you really screw up, you're yanked off the board, right? Like, the issue with the Soviets is they had a whole decade where they had, unfortunately senile sort of geriatrics running the show. And they just had one, premier kind of after the next kind of just, lead the country into the ditch. And, and there was famously that led to, perestroika and glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. In democracies, like we have geriatric political leaders, but, at least sooner, hopefully rather than later, they do get yanked off the stage when they publicly, are seen not to be capable, right? And so we kind of are a bit more self-correcting. Whereas you can make the argument that Putin, whether the long view of history will sort of look at Ukraine as a strategic blunder or maybe strategic, push, or even a victory, depending on how the conditions for the final settlement work out. It's all on him, right? Like there's nobody there to like counter the decision. They're all in. So it's like putting all your chips on that one bet, and that can work out really well, or it can be catastrophic, right? The same thing with with Xi. It's like everyone basically is a hostage to his personal decision making, and if he's smart and deliberate, he doesn't run the country into a catastrophic war or make a massive blunder, then maybe they run the table. But the risk of that type of system is you're vulnerable to that one man's decision making, and history shows us that that's usually very fragile and strategically vulnerable sort of structure to have for decision making. But at the moment right now, we're in this position where our main strategic adversary, China, hasn't made those mistakes, right? And so we can keep telling ourselves that story, but it's kind of cope until they do screw up, right? And meanwhile, we don't actually have a meaningful kind of coherent plan to respond, whether it's at the level of the defense objectives or just more like generally speaking for our system of rules for the global order. And so you see all these kind of pantomime, attempts to essentially try to just like mimic China in a way that I think is a total mistake. So China has this concept of civil-military fusion, whereby essentially all the civilian capabilities are ultimately kind of interwoven with military and state capabilities. So whether it's like tangible things like the ferries that they use, are dual use, right? They can load not just civilian cars, but they can load armored personnel carriers on those, and they've built them with those specs in mind. All the way to like the cloud infrastructure. So Tencent, Alibaba, Alipay, et cetera. These are all private operations to a certain extent, but they all have a party cell. And at the end of the day, like they have to turn over or do whatever the government tells them to do. We don't have that system, right? Thankfully, right? We have a little bit more of a hands-off between the government. But you can see this convergence where insofar as China doesn't screw up, and insofar as they successfully are able to climb the value chain in strategic industries and hollow out, more of Western manufacturing capacity, including our defense industrial base, as well as they continue to, build up the military capabilities and technological capabilities, and then look to leapfrog into these emerging domains, whether it's AI, quantum, space, new energy, new materials. The stakes are really high, and the United States, if we can't, catch up, we may feel like we need to essentially rewind the clock, either like the 1950s style, where we basically had the US government kind of run all fundamental research in the economy, right? We had kind of like scientific boards that were essentially arms of the government, giving grants and sort of steering, private sector consortiums. You're already seeing kind of comments about this with AI, that the pressure to kind of potentially nationalize or, eventually kind of put a box around these frontier AI labs could become very strong. And the urgency to kind of beat China forces us to kind of be like China. And that could have cascading effects on, Bitcoin. It could have cascading effects on how we think about the structure of liberal democracies, because they're under such an acute economic, technological challenge that the only way that the existing power structure thinks that it can, stay in the game is by emulating its adversary.
So the kind of Silicon Valley technocracy, is that an attempt to mimic China in some ways? I mean, obviously,
yeah.
And is it China owns 50% of every company or something or other?
I mean, they own a lot.
Yeah. Is that one of these mimic attempts?
I think what you're seeing more in the way of like our mimicry is, I mean, the EU is further along in this. Like, they feel like they need to create more of like a command economy where the state apportions credit to what they view as strategic industries. So in China, the People's Bank of China has a $70 billion fund to invest in semiconductor, companies. So the central bank is essentially operating as like an investment fund into a strategic, industry. We passed the Chips and Science Act, and that's, the Commerce Department writing checks and doing something similar. But, it's, half that size roughly. And it's coming out of the Treasury Department. And so everyone's sort of moving in this domain where we're sort of picking strategic industries and trying to, give them funding, grants, credit. But we're fundamentally, constrained fiscally, right? Like China's a surplus country, right? They earn surpluses from selling us their goods, and we're a fundamentally deficit country. So all of those strategic investment funds have to be borrowed, right? And that comes at a cost to all of our other requirements to fund our interest, which is now close to $1 trillion a year, as well as to meet these increasing defense obligations to secure a much more volatile and risky world, and to meet all these other political and social objectives. And so we're in this position now where we really can't emulate China, right? We don't have the basic material capacity to do it, right? We have different advantages than China has. There's a reason why like our frontier AI labs dominate, and China's trying to catch up as quickly as possible. But those are fragile advantages, right? And those could be destroyed by our attempt to emulate China, right? If we basically say, oh, we need to have a national AI initiative, and all the frontier labs need to like consolidate into one Manhattan project that's like governed by the government. I mean, it could work, but as we've seen with AI, it's usually exploring a bunch of sort of fractal trees. And it's experiment. Someone figures out something that works, and then boom, that grows into a whole nother tech tree.
Yeah, isn't the kind of almost free market for AI the arms race within the various AI companies within the US? Isn't that what's going to drive the innovation?
I mean, there's arguments that AI is its own podcast. We can zoom into that in particular, right? Because we've talked about maybe the China geopolitical risks as like probably if you think about like the common consensus blob kind of discourse inside DC in terms of what are the big problems that we need to all think about and worry about. For the last few years, it has been China, especially since Ukraine, right? It's been, okay, Putin did the thing we didn't think he was going to do. Everyone was shocked by it. Okay, what does that mean for China? Okay, everyone now has to like think about and prepare for and policy, strategize for a Taiwan scenario and maybe other sorts of, increasing conflicts and tensions with China. And then attention is now shifted to AI. It hasn't lost China, but like AI has now become like probably equivalent in terms of level of importance inside the DC policy apparatus, alongside these other strategic technologies that I mentioned. But AI is clearly like number one because AI is seen as more general purpose, almost as an enabling technology for all those other ones, right? Using AI to generate new materials, using AI for synthetic biology, using AI to support national defense, intelligence activities, and there's lots of skeptics of AI. There's lots of, I'm not going to get into like the detailed technical debate about how fast we're going to get to AGI or whatever, but like Sam Altman is going around there telling people it's coming. Powerful people, very powerful people, the most powerful people. And they act on those beliefs, right? So whether it's true or not is maybe less important than do the most powerful people in positions of influence and decision-making believe that it's going to happen? And then what will those actions be that they take given that belief? So I think people could debate people debate, is it AGI, is 2040, is it 2027, is it somewhere in between? Irrelevant to me. It's what does people making decisions now believe it's going to be? Because those are going to set the conditions for how this technology evolves. And those people believe it's happening soon.
All right, we will come back to AI.
Yeah.
Okay, so back on the global instability. And the question I want to ask you is one that you might argue subjectively or based on a more objective overview of what you've seen. But obviously there is my belief is that the desire would be to head to a more stable system. Mm-hmm. My childhood all the way through to, I would say 10 to 15 years old, 15 years ago felt like a fairly stable system. Mm-hmm. And that might be my naivety of being young and,
is there some recency bias in that as well, maybe?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. But just also, how much do you care about when you're 20, 25?
Yeah.
But and recency bias of making a podcast where I speak to the type of people who look at these issues and consider them. But are there any strong ideas or thesis behind how we trend back to a more stable global system where the various superpowers can cooperate and coexist in a more stable system where we aren't looking at the threat of some kind of regional conflict becoming more of a global conflict?
I mean, yes, there are scenarios where we avoid war. I don't think war is preordained by any means. I think decision makers, civil society has agency, and history is contingent, right? It's not deterministic. And so I could imagine a scenario where we sort of agree to muddle through. Right. Usually I don't think we're going to get a kumbaya moment where we all agree to shake hands and form arms across the world and, the enlightened, angels of our nature take over. I think it's more a matter of finding an accommodation to our strategic interests that finds a line we can each agree on. And so you can imagine a scenario where, for example, a kind of an agreement to de-escalate Ukraine comes about, right? And there's already kind of contours of a deal there. I think maybe people would like it, but okay, that's the scenario where essentially you diffuse it, probably turns into a war again in 5 or 10 years, but it's 10 years from now and a lot could happen that would change the basic foundations of that conflict.
And is the foundation of that one that saves face for Putin, allows Russia to claim a bit more land and de-escalates it for a certain period? It's almost similar to what happened after Crimea.
Yeah, I think the basic contours of the deal would essentially be, maintains the claim to Crimea, gets parts of the Donbass that they already have, agrees to some deal around the size of Ukrainian military, agrees on no NATO accession, something like that. And there probably would be more of the debate around, reconstruction costs and restitution, et cetera. Those would be the finer points that they work out. So there'll be probably a final push of fights happening this summer into the fall. And then
is that kind of framework of a deal on the table already?
Yeah, I mean, that's been explored for a while.
Who mediates this?
There's lots of different actors that have been doing different back channels. I think at this point there's direct conversations happening in third-party countries at this point. I think it's just a matter of they know what the contours of the deal are. It's a matter of what the sticking points are. And then, over the course of the summer and fall, it's kind of attritional warfare at the moment. Russia's trying to kind of achieve some key breakthroughs to kind of set the conditions for the winter where they feel comfortable establishing positions. And then depending on how cold the winter is, making it very unlivable by destroying much of Ukraine's critical infrastructure. I think they're already running like 2 to 3 gigawatts less than what they need as a society or as a country. I think it was like, these are numbers from a while ago, but like 11 or 12 gigawatts of what the original capacity was, 3 or 4 maybe has just been destroyed, maybe 2 or 3. That's significant, right? That has consequences, especially when you get to the winter in a country like Ukraine. So, and of course, everything's ultimately downstream of U.S. political system, right? Like, it's clear that, like, depending on who gets elected, the deal or not would be very different, right?
I weirdly feel like Donald Trump is the kind of guy who just like would pick up the phone to Putin and say, "Come on, let's do a deal."
Oh, he 100% would. Yeah. He even said that in the debate, right? He said he basically would do a deal before the election.
But I can't. It's this weird thing. Like, I don't even need to get into the various views of Donald Trump, but he seems like the kind of guy who can get a deal done.
He's a deal maker.
He's a deal maker.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it would be a beautiful deal.
I mean, I think you saw that with Kim Jong-un, right? It was like we went from probably being the closest we've ever gotten to like a nuclear strike on the homeland under the fire and fury. My button's bigger than your button. Like that was close. We were close. This is the only time in my career where I have like created a go bag and given my wife the plan.
Wow. So that was closer than I think perhaps we normies would think.
Yeah. And people have talked about it since then, but it was close. It was uncomfortably close.
But that is one that North Korea can't win.
No, it would not be they would not survive that as a country. It would be it would be bad. But we wouldn't. There's a chance something gets through, and it's bad news in a few American cities too.
Yeah.
So that was so that people don't really understand that moment was quite volatile. And then he did a complete 180, right? And then visited there across the border.
They hung out.
So I mean, that just if you're looking to like a template, like that's Trump, right? Trump would be someone that will push something up to the edge, as close as possible to like very, very bad, and then is happy to just completely do a 180 and do a deal. Right. And people have different views on that. People think that's reckless. That's like unacceptably high risk. But other people say, well, that's how you navigate a situation. Like that's how you have a deal with Putin and Xi, because maybe he now has established the credibility to be willing to go maybe without knowing it, that he was going that close to the edge with some things. But that's the situation that you're going to get with Trump. Right. That's just, people, it shouldn't be a surprise to people at this point.
It's fascinating.
Is the kind of left curve take on the strategy with Russia that they'll cut a deal that makes Putin happy for now, kick the can down the road, and basically hope that Putin dies before anything escalates again?
Yeah. I mean, basically, every decision maker when you're faced with this sort of uncomfortable sets of trade-offs is always just to kick the can. So it's someone else's problem.
Yeah.
Right. Like when in doubt, that's like the default move. Right. And so that's what I would expect, is some sort of arrangement that everyone can kind of live with. And that doesn't solve it, right? But kicks it 5 years down the road. Yeah. Someone's problem. So it wouldn't resolve it for all time. None of these things ever get resolved, really, right? They just kind of fester. Like we still have the DMZ with Korea, right? Like we never signed a treaty. We just agreed to kind of let it live, right? So that's sort of my base case.
Okay, so back to China.
Yeah,
the big risk or fear is that China will invade Taiwan.
I mean, that is like, in terms of the scenarios you stack up, like a aggressive all-out invasion, it's like at the top of the scale, right?
But that's kind of the only option on the table for Taiwan, right?
I mean, there are
for China with Taiwan, if they wanted to repatriate Taiwan as a Chinese.
I mean, there's active debate. People think that, it's plausible they could explore kind of a more coercive pressure campaign that is like a blockade, what they would call a quarantine, as a means of pressuring a political capitulation by the Taiwanese government.
Okay, that's considered on the table.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the scenarios. I mean, people think that that's unlikely because we would probably challenge the quarantine. They'd be forced to ante up, and then it would look like, they would lose their one advantage, which is, a kind of the surprise that you get from all of a sudden mounting an invasion. So some people discount that. I I think it is not, you couldn't rule it out, especially maybe on the lower ends of that scale, where they essentially do like the Pelosi visit style encirclement with missile bombardments plus extra things that leave the international community and the US government decision makers kind of uncertain as to whether it actually is a quarantine, right? Or they do it in a way that doesn't seem so aggressive as to trigger, US intervention, right? But is aggressive enough that it essentially compels certain segments of the Taiwanese population, especially political leadership, to make accommodations on the margin. And then China backs off. But now they've established kind of a slightly different status quo than existed before. And they can kind of do that over a long enough period of time.
Because they're patient.
And the objective of that sort of pressure campaign would be to, just like this kind of doing in the South China Sea, is to sort of show that U.S. commitments are fundamentally hollow, right? To constantly just gradually test the limit of when we will decide to push U.S. naval assets and personnel in potential positions of harm's way and risk an escalating conflict, right? So they have an incentive to just kind of gradually and delicately try to get to that line, push it a bit, see what we do. And if we don't do a whole lot, the material conditions on the ground might not be that significant, but for the relevant actors, in this case, say Philippine, leadership or Taiwanese leadership, it matters a lot to them because their national security is fundamentally premised on our political commitment to defend them. And if it seems like that political commitment is a bit iffy or there's a little wiggle room, then they have to accommodate to a different set of, conditions under which they might or may not be protected. And that, gradually shifts things in China's, sort of strategic interests. So that is China's game throughout basically, that's kind of the game everywhere, right? It's to constantly, there's an invisible line of kind of US military and economic hegemony. And they're constantly trying to, where it's kind of an open field, is just take that territory, right? And then where it's an existing, line, virtual or digital or, economic or, monetary line, it's just to sort of test it, see the limits of that line, and just sort of show the local actors, that the emperor is far away and you're right here, right? And ultimately, when push comes to shove, American leadership is going to care about American interests and not Filipino or Taiwanese interests. And so the bigger risk from the perspective of Taiwan isn't necessarily a bolt from the blue all-out invasion. It is the recognition over time that the median American voter is not going to go to war to defend Taiwan. Because then that's it. That's the game. It doesn't matter what we have on the battle plan. It doesn't matter what sort of fancy military, special gizmos we've got. Political leaders have to decide to use them, right? And if political leaders decide that the American public is not going to support the use of those tools, they're not going to be used.
But with Taiwan, is it really just a matter of when?
I think we're climbing a ladder of increasing risk of and what's basically driving it is the fundamental power or the fundamental military balance shifting in China's favor, right? So we can't really build any more ships. Basically like a few working shipyards. China has, I think maybe 300 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. Now, when we bring in the South Koreans and the Japanese, into that calculation, we're like maybe half of China, maybe a little bit more. Can't remember exactly. But like the basic, driver of all this is that China is just, they have the most rapid increase in the military capacity of any nation ever, right? So that relative balance between U.S. military dominance and China's military capacity has closed. And so decision makers in the Pentagon, that's the risk, is that what was a safe buffer is now uncomfortably not so large. And the risk is that in certain scenarios, in say the next 3 to 5 years, that that balance will close enough to think that it's, a 60-40, 80-20 proposition for Xi, maybe higher. And there's lots of war games. CSES did a war game where it doesn't look so good for the United States, especially because fundamentally there's a lot of, the first phases of that war, obviously would be like a naval missile conflict. And it's, very close to China, very far away from the US. It would rely on basically our allies, especially Japan and the Philippines, and our local assets, kind of holding the line and doing what's called a deterrence by denial strategy. So ensuring that China can't basically get the fait accompli, get the boots ashore, decapitate the political leadership, establish control of the ports, and then bring on the rest of the force to basically pacify the island and then take over the undesirables to concentration camps. And so that would be the bad scenario. So the whole strategy in defending Taiwan is basically this: prevent that initial surge, fait accompli, from a rapid takeover of the island to give time for the U.S. to then bring assets in theater. Even in those scenarios, though, like we only have a few weeks worth of these missiles. And in most of these high intensity exchanges, we're using them in a week. We don't have the capacity to resupply. China does. And so there could be these different waves, and we would lose tens of thousands of people. We would lose most of our capital ships in the area. It'd be immensely consequential. The cyber element would be extremely important at the same time. We do a lot of this professionally, which is China has a cyber threat actor group called Volt Typhoon, which is associated with the PLA. And their specific objective is to infiltrate Western critical infrastructure, U.S. critical infrastructure, in particular in Guam, but also in Hawaii and in our transportation, our telecommunications, our water and wastewater treatment facilities, other parts of our critical infrastructure. And they're there. We haven't gotten them out. It's very hard to get them out. They're using, what are called living off the land techniques, where they're not using special malware that you can discover. They're just using existing sort of tools, binaries that you can, that just look like normal activity on the system. And so very hard to find, very hard to root out. And they're extremely capable. And that scenario, those sorts of capabilities are designed explicitly in this sort of escalating dynamic where we may be considering getting involved in a conflict. Where they want to, one, disrupt our military mobilization. So actually disrupt the infrastructure around our bases, our ports, and also aircraft that are being used to lift personnel and equipment, and then also hit our civil society and instill panic. That's a key objective. Like they have different doctrine than we do, so they will actually try to disrupt like the CrowdStrike bug that led to blue screen of death on like 1% roughly of Windows machines. That was maybe a beta test, like not actually like a beta test, but it's a real world example of what sorts of disruptions can happen to critical infrastructure systems, right? Delta happened to be crippled for like a week, basically.
We know.
Yeah. So just
experienced that.
Just imagine that, but like in a targeted fashion, right? And not like accidental and just kind of disaggregated and, and also kind of simple to repair, right? You just have to reboot it with, a few, changes to the configuration. You just got to delete a file, basically. So if they wanted to cause damage, they could. And that's an active and acute concern of the U.S. government. Because these private critical infrastructure networks, they're privately operated, and we've got, thousands of wastewater, treatment facilities with their own, 30-year-old computer systems and systems that we've optimized for efficiency that China's living in. And that itself, the fact that they live there now, is itself a deterrent for U.S. political decision makers. Because unless we can confidently take them out of our networks, that's going to be a looming factor in every decision, in every policymaker or leader that decides, do I ante up along that ladder, knowing that at some point China could hit the airlines, cause chaos, could hit XYZ, and we could retaliate, right? But the thing about cyber is it's not as amenable to a clean kind of like deterrence logic like that, especially because it's hard to attribute. It's also hard to predict what the consequences of those actions are, and it's also an opportunity for third parties to kind of get in the works and potentially attack things and try to make it look like somebody else did it, do essentially a false flag op, and that creates this dynamic where everyone focuses on Taiwan and thinks it'll just be this Taiwan thing. It'll be everywhere. It'll be at home, and that I think the median American citizen, right, like. It's like, oh yeah, I want iPhones to be cheap. I don't want, China to, have to like hold that critical capacity over the Western system. I don't want the American geopolitical dominance in the Pacific to be fundamentally weak. And like, we kind of want those things, right? But in the crisis of the moment, are we going to be willing to essentially ratify decisions that won't be democratically voted for? But fundamentally, politicians know that if they take us to war, they're going to have to answer for those decisions.
So is this a fight for the TCMC? And is there a strategic thing here to delay any kind of invasion, takeover of Taiwan until chip factories are up to speed here in the US?
I mean, we're never going to replace TSMC in Taiwan.
TSMC, apologies, yeah. TSMC.
Well, I mean, we're building a few fabs here, but it's not going to replace TSMC's role. It will. The real function of those labs. Those fabs in the U.S. Like, one, it's a political thing, right? It makes us feel better. It's a little bit of like warm and soothing. And, it's really for strategic customers like the Defense Department, for the F-35, et cetera, or for maybe AI. But there's not the capacity will not be there to.
But is this a fight for chips? Is this a?
It's over. I mean, if you look on a map from China's perspective, Taiwan is like the cork in the bottle, right? They're basically hemmed in the first island chain from Japan all the way down through Okinawa to Taiwan, and then to the Philippines, and all the way down through Indonesia, the Strait of Malacca. And so if they ever want to project power, as a naval force, they have to get through the first island chain, which has a bunch of, critical choke points. And Taiwan is like right there in the center of it, right? If you look at it from their view, sort of like Cuba, to us, if most of global trade was going through the Gulf of Mexico, right? It would be really important that Cuba wasn't like, in China's control, right? Or in China's sort of orbit. So even if TSMC didn't exist, Taiwan would be strategically important to Taiwan would be strategically important to China's ambitions. But TSMC just sort of ups the ante, right? Because as we know, right, like everyone believes that semiconductors are basically the predicate for digital civilization, and whoever is the frontier of digital civilization is basically going to run the show.
Okay, so back to strategies for ensuring that we have a trajectory which is to more stability. What options are there?
Well, if that's your objective, right? So I'll grant the premise, right?
Yeah. But should that not be the objective, or should the objective to be this see who wins, this kind of head button?
This is the constant test, right? Like, and I don't know exactly where I fall, because I think I'm sort of in between. I think if you are always seeking peace, you're going to get war, right? But if you're always seeking war, you're not going to get peace, right? Like this is the paradox.
Hold on. So either way, you get war.
Well, under certain conditions, you shouldn't be seeking either peace or war. You should be seeking a sort of a modus vivendi with your adversaries, right? You should understand, and I think the United States. I think from our perspective, we need to recognize that China is a great power.
Yes.
And we just sort of need to metabolize that fact. And I think our existing leadership, especially the folks that sort of grew up and came to power, whether it's in the private sector or in our defense and sort of policy apparatus and our political apparatus, from the 90s into the 2000s, it's just very hard for them to sort of just accept that fact, right? Because they thought China would kind of always be a little brother. And would just kind of be our cheap manufacturing, outsourcing center, a brand new market. And they'd eventually fall in line. The fact that they didn't just rubs them the wrong way. And there's a certain subset of those people that just want to just whack them down, just put them in line. And so I think that's not a mature attitude, right? From my perspective, right? You just need to recognize that China is a great power. They have a legacy civilization. They have an industrial and technological capacity that you're not just going to wave your hand away. So I think a certain subset of our leadership suffers from magical thinking, and we're making policies that are just not going to be successful. So I think if we were to adapt to the reality that China is going to be a dominant player in a global system in some ways, and we need to think about what are our true strategic red lines, right? How do we actually ensure that, what are our core interests, right? Are our core interests to be the dominant world policeman? Right? If we can't even ensure that free commerce can go through, the Middle East, we need to understand what our fundamental capacities are and align ourselves with reality. If we do that, I think then we wouldn't risk overextending ourselves. And I think then China would, hopefully we'll see, this is the thing, you got to test. But if China doesn't respond, because China, some people make the argument, if you do anything like that, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, right? And that fundamentally, if we want to hope for liberal democracy and something like the rule of law to obtain in the world system, then we have to hold every inch of ground, right? And force China just to live within their box. I just don't know if that's realistic. That seems like, okay, you're just asking China to sort of accept a second role, a second fiddle role. And okay, for that to be sustainable, you actually have to materially damage their technological, economic, and military capacities so that they can never, realistically aspire to be a first-tier power like the United States.
But that feels unrealistic.
Well, that's what we've been trying to do with our export controls on semiconductors, constraints on their access to AI, sanctions on a lot of their companies. We've been trying to hamstring them, and it has not been successful. And so it's like, okay, we gave it a shot. Maybe we should try it a little bit more, see if it works. But at the end of the day, like, these are technologies that China has the talent pipeline, the industrial ecosystems, and the strategic imperative to develop.
Can the US really afford this war of attrition? Because the military budget for the US is what, $1 trillion a year-ish, 900 billion?
Yeah.
Yeah. And interest on debt alone this year is going to hit, I think, something like, what was it, 1.14 trillion or something or other, but like maybe $500 billion out. But either way, it's more than the budget for the military. It's about a third of tax receipts. It's growing every year. Is there a scenario where the US heads towards high inflation or hyperinflation scenario, which ultimately weakens them to the point of having an inability to do anything? Or does it, or add to that, does it force the US to do something a little bit more rash because it's facing those potential scenarios?
Yeah, I think our strategic discourse in the military intelligence communities has not fully reckoned with our economic and monetary vulnerabilities and fragilities. And those have only grown and are only growing over time. And there's an explicit link between China's mercantilist industrial strategy to shift from, essentially, domestic investment into manufacturing to grow their exports to the point where now basically they're running at almost an annual surplus of $1 trillion plus in exports. And so those are their dollar surpluses that in the current, economic system get recycled into mostly Western assets, mostly US assets. And so the last, 30 years has been, or more, but really hypercharged with China's entry into the global trading system and economic system has been, they produce the goods that we buy, essentially as like trade finance. They take those dollars and they reinvest them into our treasury securities. And so we basically can, fund our other imperial projects. And so basically China's surpluses result in either US unemployment, household or commercial debt, or government debt. And because we don't want to have unemployment, we don't want to have, an indebted private sector, the government has had to run structural, large deficits. And that is a feedback loop because then we have to basically print more money, which we then have to service. And because our adversary controls most of our supply chains, that doesn't leave us with a whole lot of levers to control the basic input into our interest cost, which is inflation for imports. And that's a very undesirable state of affairs to be in, especially when the amount of the debt starts to become itself an issue, because the basic balance sheet capacity of the global shadow banking system has been shown to be very fragile, right? Like the dealers that intermediate the treasury market have been known to just say, no, we're not doing this anymore. Like in March of 2020, and the Fed has to do $3 trillion of QE. And so we're in this situation where we have this acute kind of Achilles heel, which is the treasury market, that China's, mercantilist policy of, doubling down on manufacturing, exporting EVs, but also, other kind of, critical high value goods, is directly, driving our debt loads. That are then squeezing out all of our strategic priorities and increasing this asymmetric risk of instability in the treasury market.
Danny, do you know what interview I'm particularly thinking about right now?
Whitney Webb.
Yeah. So look, at this level of Discord, I'm mildly out of my depth, but anyway, we'll roll with this. We recently did an interview with Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin discussing the Bitcoin dollar system. And actually there is a large incentive within the US government for Bitcoin actually to proliferate and to be successful because it tied to the various stablecoins, it actually strengthens the US dollar hegemony. And so and it felt like a weird discussion because the US is likes to have strong controls over its currency, and to allow the stablecoins has always been like, this is a bit strange that the US government would allow this tether system to exist over there, even though it's arguably captured and blah blah. And one of the things that me and Danny for the last few years have like discussed quite a lot on this podcast is the idea is that you shouldn't really fight China with its own strategy of control because they're better at control. They're a centralized communist party. You fight them with freedom, and what is a freedom technology is Bitcoin. And I'm reticent to use the word Bitcoin fixes this with such a complex global issue. But at the same time, a proliferation of Bitcoin, a successful Bitcoin, would onboard a significant amount of wealth within the US because a large amount of Bitcoin is held within the US. And if the US government was also to continue to hold Bitcoin and continue to increase its holdings of Bitcoin, that economically it can actually strengthen itself at a time of significant weakness. I think you can see where I'm going.
Yeah.
Is there any validity to that concept? I mean, we talk to you about a lot of things, but you're here also because you are a Bitcoiner. Where does this play into this?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about that, I don't know, 4.5, 5 years ago in my first piece for BPI. I think my first appearance here, Bitcoin, U.S. National Security Initial Assessment was my first white paper. And in that, I basically made that exact argument that there's a sort of a strategic and synergistic effect between the proliferation of dollar-based stablecoins, which provide essentially an endogenous link to treasury securities, if they're properly and fully reserved, and Bitcoin's adoption, where you want to have natively crypto rails and you want to have currency liquidity in your normal medium of exchange with Bitcoin as a reserve asset. And so you can imagine the proliferation of dollar-based stablecoins that are backed by treasury securities and that are anchored to or aligned with the development of Bitcoin. Adoption of Bitcoin around the world as being, positive sum for the U.S., essentially linking together the success of Bitcoin and demand for U.S. debt. But there's another key, I think aspect that people haven't paid much attention to, and it goes back to that dynamic that I was just putting to and this is become political, but I think it's more just a diagnostic of what has driven, a lot of the pathologies of our current political society, which is the hollowing out of the defense industrial base, our manufacturing capacity, the rise of inequality, the benefits that have accrued to the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate at the expense of the other sectors in the economy, has been a direct result of kind of this global economic system being fundamentally imbalanced, right? Where China essentially was running this mercantilist strategy. Our elites kind of agreed to kind of let it run to a certain extent, maybe let it run too far because they were also getting rich off of it. Because the key function of those surpluses have to be absorbed somewhere. Well, they get absorbed into financial assets, right? So we have then basically been the world's recipient of all those foreign surpluses, including those that are mostly coming from our adversaries. Increasingly, those are the source of surpluses, or middle powers that want to be more strategically autonomous, like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So we have had to create financial assets that has, benefited the people who are creating those financial assets, and, collecting 2 and 20. But stock market goes up, people that don't hold stocks don't win, and the elite class then has a perverse incentive to just keep that system running, and that has now led to the atrophy of our defense industrial base. And depending on waking up to the fact that the system being run for this long has now put us in an acutely vulnerable position relative to our adversary. So they know it needs to change, but it's got a lot of embedded inertia in a lot of political economy. So there's actually an interesting role that Bitcoin could play here, which is, okay, the problem is, these foreign surpluses. So you can do 2 things. One is you can block those foreign surpluses, with tariffs. You can tax them. Essentially, that's one leading proposal. Tax the capital inflows, which you could do, or you redirect them, or you tax them and force them into Bitcoin, right? So think about when the Mag 7 go up, right? That maybe has pernicious second order consequences, right? Because it maybe inflates it creates asset bubbles. Maybe it leads to misallocation of capital in our capital system. It gives disproportionate power to tech elite oligarchs. Maybe it creates more of a patronage system where it's whoever gets to control the flow kind of can win. There's an argument to be made that if you actually direct some of those flows into Bitcoin, well, it's kind of this shock absorber, right? And it also tends to benefit the United States relative to our adversaries because we hold not just the government, but our citizens in our private market holds a lot of Bitcoin. So we would stand to gain relative to our adversaries. And in this more acute risk scenario where, say, there is a conflict or a crisis or a massive crisis in the treasury market itself that leads to loss of confidence, right? Because of this flywheel keeps going, we're going to have to keep piling on more and more debt. Eventually, foreigners, Japanese even, might have to look out for their own interests unless we can force them to buy our debt, which could be our next move, right? We essentially create a tech and tariff club, and to be a member of the club, you essentially have to term out our debt for us, right? Exchange your short-term debt for longer-term debt, maybe even century bonds or whatever. That could be the move we do to kind of buy time. But fundamentally, that's going to cost a lot of diplomatic capital to force our allies to essentially help keep the train going, right?
Yeah, it's
And
just
that-
kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, it kicks the can. It also has consequences for other things you might want the Japanese to do, whether it's on the defense side or other economic domains like semiconductor and export controls on China. So there's a lot of cost to that sort of strategy. Whereas if you essentially look at Bitcoin as this alternative neutral reserve asset that you happen to control a disproportionate share of, relative to that destabilizing event leading to the monetization of gold, which would advantage sort of the BRICS, such the loose coalition of BRICS challengers that have been accumulating gold, right? Russia, China, even India and Iran and Turkey. That's their old standby. And so that's their backup plan if the legacy dollar system, hits a snag. We don't really have that such a backup plan. Putting all of our chips on the treasury market. That's fine. You can do what you can. And maybe in Bitcoin in the near term can help you kind of shore up some of that demand with stablecoin kind of endogenous growth. But actually Bitcoin itself could be a useful neutral reserve asset that you could, have as a part of a diversified strategy to hedge against those sorts of tail risks. So yeah, I think it's smart.
Look, I know you think it, but do you think there are aspects within the US government that that truly understand Bitcoin and strategically thinking about how this might be a viable solution to these current issues?
I think or is
it happening just organically?
I don't know if there's like a secret room of people in the Defense Department that have this on the whiteboard. Yeah. I've talked to certain people in the intelligence and defense communities, and there's a recognition that this is an issue. The problem is the defense intelligence community, one, they don't make policy at this level. They don't make economic policy. Finally, these are political decisions, right, at this scale. So that's where you're talking about, White House level decision makers have to sort of pick this up, and senior legislators have to pick this up.
But
and
organically, it might happen.
It is happening.
Oh, okay. So it is happening.
Yeah, that conversation's happening.
Okay, interesting.
I wouldn't say it's like fully mature, like they've thought around all the second order consequences, or that it's all worked out as part of some grand strategy. But I think it is now in the window of discourse.
Fascinating. Okay, so add into that, China obviously banned Bitcoin mining, has been adverse to allowing people to have Bitcoin, but there's whispers, articles, writings, the general discourse seems to be pointed that China is softening with regards to Bitcoin itself. And is it viable that we will have a Bitcoin arms race, and that is the thing that could take us back to a more stable trajectory? I know it's a bit of Bitcoin fixes this on such a massive, complex issue. But
I mean, there's two parts to that. One is, do we get this Bitcoin arms race? So then what does that mean for the geopolitical order? The first ones will be easier to answer. I think we're close to it. It could happen. I think going back to my earlier model of like, how do you think about the world system? Is it these abstract bureaucratic entities like nation states and their complicated sort of faceless bureaucracies? Or are they individuals, usually really powerful individuals at the top of a certain power, status hierarchy, right? Like, President of the United States, Mohammed bin Salman, Sheikh Taknoon in the Emirates, President Xi and his, close coterie, and a bunch of other uber oligarchs with trillions of dollars, collectively between offshore accounts, right? And the thing about, unfortunate to say, is that usually great power shifts or monetary shifts happen in small elite circles first, right? People decide to change things. And usually they decide because they think they can get a personal or collective advantage out of those changes happening. And
but
usually,
that hasn't happened with Bitcoin, has it? Right?
It hasn't, but you could see...
But it's happening now, like Larry Fink. Is that him?
I could paint a scenario where... Let's just paint a picture. This isn't a prediction, but I could, assume Trump. Let's see a scenario where Trump wins. Whether Larry Fink takes a position in the administration, who knows? But would have a lot of influence. He would be, Trump would be, would have a lot of people would have the ear of Trump that would be very pro Bitcoin, including, maybe Elon Musk, maybe other, folks that have, very large bags of Bitcoin. And so they have both a personal incentive and maybe also a strategic vision that aligns these things together. And, you could see policy programs being pushed by the United States that then trigger reaction by other countries, right? And that, you can argue that like David Bailey's game is exactly that, right? He's trying to meme using Trump essentially as the center of this vortex, sort of get that vortex spinning, and then it forces everyone else kind of into that vortex. whether they wanted to or not. It's just now, and then because it's mutually reinforcing. Now, how far that goes, right? Because it's not just like, I think the thing about people need to think about these systems is Bitcoin, if it's now becoming geopolitical, right? But it's not there yet, but it's like, it's climbing the ladder. But once
it's on the ballot for this election. I mean, we may have Kamala, RFK, and Trump all at the Bitcoin conference.
And it's a political conference at this point.
Yeah, it is a political conference. No, it absolutely is. Can you think of any other tech industry where they have a conference or any other industry in the entirety of the United States where all three, let's be honest, there's three of them now. There's Kamala, RFK, and Trump. All will strategically feel like they need to attend.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think about it as like, essentially it's a counter elite system being formed, very like loose, disaggregated. Because if you think about like what is RFK and Trump and Elon and sort of the tech folks and also endogenous legacy Bitcoiners have in common is they're all folks that maybe weren't part of like the existing technocratic meritocratic power structure.
The rogue elites.
Yeah, essentially they were elites in some form, right? Whether they're just, Bitcoin billionaires who just kind of hit the jackpot, or they founded tech companies, or they're heterodox political figures. And so, there's kind of this, fundamentally then that alignment is a political alignment, right? It's not necessarily one about, Bitcoin per se, but it's like whatever the larger forces of American politics have sort of pushed them together, right? And that's my current understanding of why this is happening, right? But yeah, it's a fascinating development. I think it also isn't necessarily, I think we've really understood kind of what this means because it's, the same sorts of forces that are around this also are like driving all sorts of grifting and just like absolute, just like, just not great people, right?
Yeah,
so you gotta like separate the wheat from the chaff here to like understand what is just people trying to like make a buck off of like the next vibe, wave hype thing, this is the thing versus, okay, like an actual, structural change to, systems of elites that didn't really talk to each other, but now do, and now are forging kind of a political alignment to try to take power. I mean, that's the history of, counter elites is they're counter elites because they're not in the power structure, right? But they want to be, right? And so, but they're not as powerful as the legacy power structure. So they want to erode it, challenge it, come at it, right? Take it over, right? That's I think what we're seeing. We'll see if it's successful. I don't know.
I mean, look, this is wild.
I think we're facing a decade of disruption across all these different domains because you're seeing everything we've talked about, the critical emergent technologies, the great power confrontation is leading to a fragmentation of existing systems, the rise of potential tail risks. And just, I mean, my overall comment is that, no one can really predict these things. And I think the way I see that is like the ability to predict itself is being fundamentally destroyed. And I think the most important consequence of all these things is that fact itself, right? That usually when people think about the future, they think in sort of basic chunks. They think, okay, what am I doing tonight for dinner with my family or whatever? What's happening the rest of this week? Do I have a big client meeting or a school event or a soccer game or whatever? And then what's happening with family vacation or Thanksgiving or Christmas? And then, okay, there's like the next few years out there, job, promotion, yada, 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 house move, whatever. And then usually you jump to like retirement, college tuition, whatever, right? You think of these big jumps. And most people's like 20, 30 year plans are not like, they don't change that much, right? Like you have a certain vision, it's like vague, somewhat fuzzy of like, I want to be successful. I want to be comfortable. I want to have a family. I want to be somewhere nice. I want to like be satisfied. We don't really have it's a clear but like stable vision of your, notional future. And I think the stability of those future visions is what also anchors present day political stability, right? You usually get huge present political volatility when those, amorphous pictures of the, 20, 30 year future are subject to radical readjustment or fundamental uncertainty.
Why is that? Because decision making just gets muddy at that point.
Because you can no longer credibly imagine such a future. Because you have to tell a story that gets you from here to there, that's consistent in your mind. And when you have, when you've recently confronted such radical change, and when all the headlines are blasting that change is only going to continue and accelerate, then you lose the confidence that you have now in the ability to even, look out that far. And then it then forces kind of a contraction, a foreshortening of everyone's kind of collective imaginations. And also, I think leads to much more of a zero-sum politics, much more of a competitive and volatile environment because nothing is really as anchored as it used to be. And there's fundamentally a blank space in the future that someone is competing to write into. And that ups the stakes across everything, right? And that I don't think we understand, like that affects everything from the Bitcoin stuff to geopolitical stuff, individual decision-making, and it injects radical uncertainty into everyone's futures. And yeah, there's things we have talked about that I think will contribute to that uncertainty.
And this is the fun bit.
Well, and the truth is, this might just all be a simulation to test how this all plays out. We might just all be.
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, simulation, multiverse. It makes you think that these events that we've recently been living through don't seem real. They seem like hyper real. To use like the
testing.
To use like almost to use like the Baudrillardian term. It's like we're living in a scripted sort of event, right?
Do you remember the original SimCity where it was grid above? And you build your city and you put in the pipe works and everyone would build it like New York in a grid. And then you'd get a bit bored and you'd throw Godzilla in there and see what happens. You would just throw Godzilla in there and see what happens. City, you go around, breathe some fire and the fireman will come and fix it. But that's what it feels like. It's like we get in the SimCity, Godzilla's coming in now. It's just massive event after massive event. It's like, hold on a fucking second. Can we have some breathing space? Well, take me back to the 90s. Yeah. I want my Spooky Dokies back.
Well, it's almost like... if you think about
I don't know that reference, but
Spooky Dokies. No. So we used to get your BMX. Like life was simple back in the 90s. There was no internet. You went to a concert, you watched it, not through your phone.
Yeah.
And on your BMX, you used to get Spooky Dokies. There were these little plastic things you put on the spokes of your BMX.
Oh, I know what they are.
They would make the noise. I just want the simple life. I want my Spooky Dokies. I want my Garbage Pail Kids. I want my sticker gum. I just want my easy life. And we've got all this fucking bullshit to deal with. God knows what. Yeah, my son over there is thinking it's a different world for him.
Yeah, I know. And it's like if you were trying to find like this, if you were running, a simulation, right? You would want not the simulation just to like end a nuclear war. That's boring, right? You got to restart the game. You got to start over, right? But you also wouldn't want to be like perfectly stable and peaceful and everyone just doing the same thing. It'd be boring, right? So you want to try to find this critical path where you're constantly skating between disaster and like, stability. Like you want to try to find that perfect line. It's almost like you're a skier going down like the edge of the mountain, right? And it's like, if you screw up, you're dead, game over. But there's an immense amount of like, just that's what attracts like that, the incitement, like that's the energy, right? The energy is staying on that line, right? That's like, so if you're like if you're a universe designer, like the objective is design a simulation that kind of keeps you on that critical line. Nothing ever totally blows up, but you get so close every time.
I think the thing is, though, they would keep finding it's the humans who keep fucking this up.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is endogenous to human society. If you had social media back in Napoleonic era, it would be batshit all the time, right? Like here's this guy who's just all of a sudden mounted this massive cavalry army is just conquering Europe. Is just like YOLOing across like these old imperial systems. Is just like this is mine now. Right, like that would be crazy if everyone was like tweeting from it. Right, there would be like we're getting like the live stream of Napoleon. Like it would be probably crazier than what we have right now. Right. If you went like the Mongol horde, or if you're like we've had historical periods where if you were in that system, it would be total bonkers. The Black Death. Everyone around you is just dropping like flies. So I think people think that now is the craziest time. It's like I don't know. Like humanity has been going through some stuff.
Yeah, but now is the time where we can easily just kill ourselves in multiple ways. Kill everyone.
True. Yeah. I mean, that is different, right? We can kill each other at a scale that we haven't had before.
And we're living in real time, or our perception of real time. But if this is a simulation, this for them might be happening like, right, that didn't work that time, let's do another one.
I mean, I reject the simulation hypothesis. I think it's a fun toy argument, but for like metaphysical and physical reasons, I think it's a flawed hypothesis.
Why? Give me the reason.
So fundamentally, I think you need to run computations to find out what they're doing, right? Like Stephen Wolfram has this idea of computational irreducibility. Any complex system or any system among a bare minimum level of complexity, you fundamentally can't predict what it's going to do. So there's a version of the simulation hypothesis that I guess I could subscribe to, but is almost a trivial statement that is just amounts to saying that physics is fundamentally computational. Physics is essentially a system of rules. The universe is running those rules, and the universe is essentially computing the next thing. The premise that's usually embedded in a simulation argument is that there's someone at another layer that is observing this system and is sort of extracting features out of it, is sort of making predictions, is sort of steering it in a certain way. So that I don't think is plausible, right? That doesn't fit the basic premise of physics being fundamentally computational and essentially like multi-computational, where you can never really jump ahead to see what any given algorithm is going to do. There's certain pockets of reducibility where that's what most of physics is we figured out sort of regularities in the stew of the computations that are the universe that are like regularities that we can understand. And those are, we can put systems of linear equations to model those phenomena, and that's basically the physics we understand. But the universe doesn't necessarily abide by that, at its most cosmic scale. The universe is just running computations. And we are observers, which are just bundles or subsets of computations in this larger unfolding, multi-way computation. And so we're fundamentally looking out at the rest of the universe. And we're defined as observers by two things. One is we have finite computational capacity, and we perceive ourselves as linear sort of threads of time. And so we are embedded in the sort of threads of computation that fundamentally are, irreducible, meaning you can never predict what's going to happen next. So the universe is just doing this, is just running, right? And so you could say that is the simulation, but there's an argument that's like, the simulator has no better vantage point than we do, right? The simulator is watching it the same way we're watching it. In fact, maybe they're fundamentally limited in ways that we aren't. Right? If you are an observer of the type that can observe the whole system, there are probably features of the system you can't see that you only can see if you're embedded in the system itself. This, I think, is the nature of reality, right? Like we are embedded, subsets of computation that have to see a certain type of physics because of that, right? So we have to see, what amounts to discrete algebra at the bottom, which is like quantum mechanics, and we see a continuous geometry at the top, which is general relativity. So we see aspects of reality essentially that reflect, in mathematics, which is called this homotopic tower, where reality essentially is just the set of all possible rules being run in all possible ways, and that set mathematically you could describe as an infinity groupoid, and the class of infinity groupoid of the set of all possible infinity groupoids is something called an infinity one topos. And infinity one topos, by Grothendieck's homotopy hypothesis, is a topological space. So the universe is a space. You slice it as an observer. So you see slices of reality as an observer that, if you have those boundary constraints that we have, being a certain type of observer, gives us the physics that we see. So that was my.
That was my other view. Yeah. that was the other.
Yeah, you forced me here.
I was about to say that, and you rudely interrupted me with that.
Yeah. So the universe, in a sense, this is where in philosophy, you've had kind of this constant tug and pull between empiricism and idealism, where you could imagine like two different limits that you take. In empiricism, you sort of discount the observer entirely in the limit, and all of the computational work happens external to the observer in reality. So the fundamental view of an empiricist is, I am like this objective, neutral, almost blank slate observer, and I'm just looking out at the universe, and I'm trying to empirically discern the patterns and regularities out there. The sort of idealistic school of thought and philosophy was the exact opposite. The whole universe happens inside of one observer. All of that computational complexity is embedded inside one single mind, right? And that's like the Bishop Berkeley idealism.
But isn't that the argument for quantum? What is it? The observer effect of quantum mechanics.
This is a little bit more abstract, a little bit more conceptually fundamental than interpretations of quantum mechanics. This is almost like metaphysics with interpretations through this kind of this like computational view of reality. But the basic point is, these have been the massive debates in philosophy of metaphysics for hundreds of years. Of like, are you fundamentally an empiricist like John Locke, or are you fundamentally an idealist like Bishop Berkeley? And I think that's actually almost like a free parameter, right? Like the boundary, like how you decide where you want to draw that line of the observer as either just like infinitesimal point or maximally the entire universe. Like that's almost like a matter of aesthetics to a certain extent. Like how much computational work you want to decide the universe does versus you as an observer or a stipulated observer is basically an entirely like an arbitrary free choice. And so it's not like there's a truth to the matter of, is it just running in the universe as a God mind, or are we just, a pinpoint and the universe is this sort of, irreducible complexity we can't imagine? I think the thing that makes us interesting as observers is we're kind of in the middle, right? We have a lot of complex computation happening in whatever is making us, conscious creatures, that see a world and have a world model inside of us. But there's also a huge amount of complexity and computation happening outside of us. And so we happen to be observers of a certain type at a certain scale where we're kind of, in the middle. And so when you're an observer of that kind, you get this interplay and you get this debate, right? But there might be observers that are like very, very, very simple, and therefore the physics they see doesn't look like the physics we see. Or there's observers that are much, much more sophisticated and complex, and their pictures of reality are very different from ours. So that's my philosophy of science and physics right there.
So we're not just characters in Alien SimCity.
I think our conceptual vocabulary is mostly informed by sci-fi tropes and sort of folk philosophy. But if you actually want to get to like a root understanding of reality, at least a partial view, you have to like shed some of that cruft and think about things in a way that stretches the current conceptual vocabulary we have. Like reality is not going to necessarily align with like whatever folk vocabularies that we've had for the last 30 years of sci-fi trope.
I'm conscious of time.
And there's a fun bit to get into.
Yeah,
we can do it.
We haven't covered.
Well, this is a good segue.
The aliens.
Yeah.
So where are we with the? Because we've discussed aliens with you a couple of times. We've gone into UAPs.
Yep.
There was that period we went through where it was kind of getting hot in Congress. Where are we now? Because it feels like it's gone quiet again.
Quiet just before the storm.
No, I'm making my way through it slowly.
Yeah, it's very slow.
So actually, it was interesting. The day we recorded last year, I believe, was the day that several senior senators introduced a bill, an amendment to the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act that was called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Disclosure Act, UAPDA. That was just almost a little over a year ago. And that bill, which I encourage everyone to just Google, look up the UAPDA and read it. 64 pages of densely, well-constructed, seriously, organized legislative language that states in no uncertain terms the Senate's view of this subject as being very, very serious. And that, so we can talk about the substance, but just kind of the process since then has been, it was introduced, it passed out of the Senate. It was a manager's amendment, actually, from Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds. So Senator Schumer was the majority leader, and he was co-sponsored by Senator Todd Young, Marco Rubio, Gillibrand, and Martin Heinrich. So folks of very senior positions, both sides of the aisle, representing the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Senate Armed Services Committee, the majority leader, folks that are part of the Gang of Eight, which is the most sort of senior group in the Congress, clear to our most sensitive programs. And they introduced this bill. And it passed out of the Senate. The House didn't have a version of that bill. So when the NDA came into conference committee to reconcile the two versions, there was a massive behind-the-scenes fight negotiation over what would happen with the provisions in this bill. And most of the core substantive provisions of the UAPDA were stripped out. In particular, a provision that would establish this independent commission, what they called the UAP Records Review Board, the URRB, which would be an independent panel established with all the authorities of an executive department agency, would have 9 members that would be nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, like Supreme Court positions. They would hold 7-year terms, and they stipulated the positions those people had to represent that would align to elements of national power. So someone from a national security background, foreign relations background, like a senior diplomat, a historian, someone from like the technical sciences, a sociologist, an economist, and then sort of someone from civil society representing sort of UAP sort of civil groups, and a biologist. And so that was, some of those weren't specifically stipulated, but there was understanding that would be the kind of representation of those 9 people. And they would have the ability to basically subpoena any records from the U.S. government on UAPs, specifically defining UAP as temporary unattributed objects, right? But objects that haven't been prosaically associated with any known aircraft in either our or our adversaries' arsenals, and that are not weather balloons or bugs or whatever, or sort of weather artifacts, but that demonstrate certain indicators, right? So hypersonic velocity, no means of visible propulsion or lift, the ability to go between different mediums, so transmedium travel, space to air, air to water, et cetera. So they had a whole list of these indicators of what defined a UAP. The bill also defined, it mentions non-human intelligence 14 times, and it defines non-human intelligence as any sentient life form known to the U.S. government, that is associated with technologies of unknown origin. And they define technologies of unknown origin, TUO, as essentially retrieved materials, ejecta, or fully intact craft associated with UAPs. And they also define non-human intelligence as, they also define biological materials associated with technologies of unknown origin. And they give this review board powers of eminent domain to inspect and make disposition decisions on those materials, both technologies of unknown origin and biological materials, decide whether they fit the definitions that they have, and decide whether they need to redispose of them, meaning take them into possession of the federal government, or disclose them in a controlled fashion. And it would give the powers of this group to create, essentially, to decide to disclose. They would be able to override any classification in the U.S. government, and they could subpoena witnesses. They could go visit facilities. They could hold people in contempt or make criminal referrals to the Justice Department. And essentially, their job is to disclose to the American public the federal government's knowledge of UAPs. And the reasons why they say is basically they have findings in this bill where they say, and by the way, I'm saying this because they just recently reintroduced it, right?
Okay.
So they reintroduced it about 2 weeks ago and basically changed nothing, right? So there's this big fight, and Congress, the House basically didn't want some of these provisions, and the Senate, specifically Senator Rounds and Senator Schumer, went to the Senate floor after their bill basically got gutted, and they were not happy. And they gave a scripted colloquy on the Senate floor, like an 8-minute speech where they had written together, each had parts. And they basically said, we're not giving up on this. In the interest of transparency and accountability, we're going to push for, this UAP Disclosure Act in the future. And that's what they did. They came back, and after all this conversation, they said, no, we're going to double down. And they didn't trust the ARROW, the office inside the Pentagon that had been set up nominally to kind of investigate this stuff, but has basically been essentially doing a cover job, right? Which is what you would expect, right? And the Senate's not buying it. And so they're like, and the ARROW tried to basically kill this bill. Specifically, they went through and they tried to they gave the Defense Department the ability to kind of comment on the draft legislation. And actually just today came out like a version of the bill where they had, the Pentagon was like, red line out all of references to technologies of unknown origin, biological materials, and then give the role that the Senate wanted to give to this independent review board. They wanted to give that role to ARROW itself. So all the witnesses or powers, it's like, oh, you should just give it to this group inside the Pentagon to investigate the Pentagon, right? And so the Senate's not buying it, right? The Senate's doubling down on the definitions, and they specifically say that this legislation is necessary because credible evidence indicates that UAP records exist that have not been subject to mandatory declassification as a result of an overbroad interpretation of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and a misapplication of transnuclear foreign intelligence, which is, inside the Atomic Energy Act, there's provisions to classify special nuclear materials and intelligence on foreign nuclear capabilities that we gather that are not subject to the same sorts of disclosure and declassification procedures. So that's basically been the argument, is that we've been compartmenting these programs, in that apparatus of secrecy since the Manhattan Project. So we're in this position now where coming into the summer, there's going to be some major things happening. So the objective essentially of the things that are going to happen the rest of this year is to get as close to the full package that's in the UAPDA passed, right? So that the next president will essentially preside over the nominations and then review the declassification and disclosure determinations of the review board. Only the president will have essentially the final veto, right, over those determinations. The review board has to provide like a UAP disclosure campaign plan. And there's all these restrictions on like what the agencies, if they say that we don't want this to be declassified, there have to be like specific reasons published. So there's a lot of stakes coming on like this bill that's going to be now reintroduced as part of the FY25 NDAA, and that will likely come to a similar sort of contention in conference committee later this year, probably November, December, where behind closed doors will be a debate about how much of this package will actually make it into law. Because the NDAA is one of those bills that always gets passed, right? And so this is the fight that's happening now. And so there's going to be a wave of public discourse that's going to start next month in August that is designed to generate such momentum to push the UAPDA across the line. So in particular, what's going to start this will be a book that's coming out by a gentleman named Lou Elizondo, who was kind of the original guy, started this all in 2017, helped get those videos out to the New York Times. He was a guy who he's a career, absolute boss inside the Pentagon. He was a member of what's called the Intelligence Support Activity, kind of like Delta Force, but would go behind enemy lines to scout things out. He counterintelligence officer, counterterrorism officer, did a bunch of stuff, and it was tapped basically to run the sort of this UFO program inside the Pentagon in 2008. And so he's coming out with this tell-all book, basically, called Imminent in
title.
In August. Then there's going to be 2 documentaries coming out with people that no one's heard of yet that are going to make pretty eye-opening claims, and that those people will have the credentials to back those claims up.
Can you say what those claims are?
I mean, basically that everything David Grush said in testimony is true.
So
right?
that they've retrieved craft.
Yes.
And that they've found biological...
Yeah.
beings.
Essentially what the UAP says, which is that there are these legacy programs to retrieve and exploit, reverse engineer technologies of unknown origin and biological materials. Those programs exist. The Senate legislation is premised on those programs existing. The purpose is to investigate those programs and to force the information and records and materials that they hold into a more formal and legitimate and accountable process, and then to disclose certain elements of those programs to the public. I think they want to do it.
And is there anything new that Grush didn't say that he's going to reveal?
So this is all about, again, Grush. I don't think the job is to say anything new. It's to get more senior people to say basically the same thing.
Okay, so take it more seriously.
So David Grush was sort of the first door opener to establish and into the discourse this concept of retrieved craft and biological materials. That was what? And you saw that people in Congress being like, what are you talking about? And then the Senate comes out with this bill that says biological materials, technologies of unknown origin, defines legacy programs. It ensures that nobody that's on this review board can be associated with those legacy programs.
What do you think biological materials means?
Bodies of non-human entities.
Aliens.
I don't know what you mean by aliens, but a biological creature
That didn't.
of a morphology that we don't recognize as being associated with any sort of phylogenetic tree.
It came from another planet.
Or has it been here forever?
There's other hypotheses.
Yeah, it's been here forever.
I mean, we are about to create synthetic life. We are thinking about engineering complex synthetic biological systems, biomechanical systems. Most of the things on DARPA's drawing board for 20 years is the convergence of synthetic biology, robotics, and AI. So you can imagine these being synthetic biological creatures designed to perform certain functions, not necessarily,
but come from somewhere else.
or made by something else. Not necessarily coming from somewhere else. But the objective this year, just to make it more practical, is to have more and more senior people come out, essentially saying that, ratifying those core statements, right? Not going any further than that, and then trying to hold the line to then trigger a formal process. Because what the folks pushing for disclosure don't want is what they call catastrophic disclosure, which is the sort of uncontrolled spilling of all the stuff associated with this topic in a way that would cause social.
Yeah, but we want to see shit. Let's be honest. We want to see a spaceship, or we want to see a little green man. Let's be honest. We do. Because otherwise, it's just somebody says something.
But that's the objective. The objective isn't to convince everyone at the same time. In fact, that's the exact opposite objective. Because if everyone all of a sudden went from thinking this isn't true to thinking it is true, well, you could have disruptive social effects.
Yeah.
So the objective is to increase
Of course.
the number of people that think this is true by a few percentage points every few months.
But we gradually get there.
And that's the point. That's the point of having this 7-year project where you establish sort of a rolling consensus on these things.
If we've had, or if someone's had access to these crafts for decades potentially, and they're trying to reverse engineer it, why haven't we had the technological breakthroughs to be able to do the kind of propulsion that they do? Is it because we don't have a fundamental understanding of the physics?
Maybe this is the strategic advantage they have if we were to go to global conflict. At that point, they have the technology to stop it.
Well,
they could just go.
So there's 2 ways to answer that. So one is the U.S. government always keeps ace in the hole capabilities for country defending existential fights.
So they may understand
you don't use those in just Iraq, Afghanistan. You use those when you've got no other option, right? So I'm not saying we have some anti-gravity super stuff. I'm just saying the fact that it hasn't diffused into our broader technological paradigm that we understand isn't proof that it doesn't exist, right? And it would likely be something that would complicate any disclosure effort, because if we did have, say, inspired technological platforms that we've weaponized, or for ISR systems, et cetera, well, the Gang of Eight wouldn't want to harm the strategic advantage those systems give us. So I think what's happening, you've even heard, you can imply this, you can infer this from some of the statements that Senator Rounds, the lead co-sponsor of the bill, has given, which is he wants to have accountability and disclosure and transparency, but he doesn't want to harm national security. And I think they're sort of pointing obliquely at the fact that they want to try to cleave those things. They want to try to ensure that there can be a necessary recognition of the core truth. The existence of non-human intelligence is not government information. It's a fact of reality, right? The government can't classify the existence of the moon, right? The existence of non-human intelligence is not a government piece of information. It's just a state of the world.
Yep.
The capabilities of the U.S. military, to do things with certain aerospace platforms is government information that they definitely need to protect. And so the problem is, maybe historically, as you would imagine, if we had certain technologies of unknown origin, well, of course, what we would probably use them mostly for is to inspire, really advanced capabilities. If we could, that would be like the primary objective, other than understanding what they're here and what they're doing, right? You would both be like, why are they here? What are they doing? But also like, let's get as much weapons and stuff out of this as possible, right?
Yeah.
And so that would mean that the apparatus of secrecy, the compartments, the engineers, the whole structure that the Senate is trying to, get better accountability of, and then to disclose in a controlled fashion, those are like conjoined twins. And of course, the folks that have been managing those alleged legacy programs have no interest in making that easy, right? They have every interest in basically saying, these are so conjoined, you cannot disclose really anything about this basic NHI fact of, and without fundamentally compromising, our national strategic advantage from maybe having inspired certain systems as a result. But the Senate has said in the bill, like, what's motivating this is basically the risk of technological surprise from our adversaries, right? Like, we shouldn't assume maybe we're the only ones that have such programs. And as we talked about with the competition with China, is on, explicitly capturing the strategic advantage from science and technology. And if, we've been compartmenting these things so tightly to keep this, secret bottled up, we have maybe 50, 100 people total working on some of this stuff in different domains, you better hope you got the right people. Otherwise, there might not make a whole lot of progress. Whereas China might feel like, we need to play massive catch up, and we don't necessarily care as much about, when you're playing catch up, your risk reward versus disclosure, and you're also just, an authoritarian society where, if you look sideways, you're going to get taken to the gulag, right? So maybe they feel better that they can actually put maybe 10,000 people into those reverse engineering programs. And if they've got that, that would put a whole lot of anxiety behind the Gang of Eight, being like, wait a second, maybe it made sense to keep this a secret during, the previous era, but now that maybe China's potentially getting this, potentially catching up, well, the game's changed, and the balance between disclosure and secrecy is different. So that's what they said. They basically said, technological surprise, ensuring, essentially the public interest, and fostering open science and technological research and development. Like, that's an explicit objective they write as to why you would need this records review board to foster transparency. So that's like the objective this year. So to get this bill passed, that's probably like the sole thing. And I think there's recognition of the pro-disclosure folks that have firsthand knowledge of these programs and want this to come out is coming forward in a controlled way. So I expect senior people to come out.
Where are you percentage-wise now? We always ask you this.
I think in terms of the fact of NHI,
Yeah,
I'm like 95%.
Whew, where did we start?
I think we said like 50 last time.
I don't remember where I was last time. Maybe I was like,
It's a lot
maybe I
lower.
was
It was
like
definitely
80.
lower than 95.
No, I'm like 95 at this point.
Damn, it's not a big psyop.
Yeah, but like everything else, like we talked about, like the branch of the tree, like in terms of explanations. I'll point, if folks want to learn more about this. So Carl Nell, it's very important. Most people may have heard of David Grush, who's the intelligence officer, testified to some of the stuff. Carl Nell is a more senior to David Grush, but from the Army, also liaison to the UAP task force that David Grush was on, and it was in that role that David Grush, discovered these programs as part of this congressional mandate to report back on these things that whistleblowers have been talking about. Carl Nell has had lots of very senior positions. He was a senior executive in both Lockheed and Northrop, as well as on Army Futures Command. I believe he's a firsthand his firsthand knowledge of some of these programs. And he stated, at the SALT conference, Scaramucci's conference, like a month or two ago, he had the final keynote session, and he came out and his first, scripted line was basically, non-human intelligence is real. Non-human intelligence is here and has been interacting with humanity for a long time. And senior non-elected government officials are aware of that fact. So he just came out the gate, retired Colonel Carl Nell, senior guy, defense. He was involved in our foreign technology program, which is our reverse engineering program for foreign systems. He's held very serious positions. He said that. So the ratchet was kind of like David Grush, the first guy, Carl Nell coming out validating that. He validated it before in the initial article, but he just kind of came hard to the paint and said it just straight out. And people would just, and there was like an investors conference, like, what did that guy just say? Like, what? And people were just like, okay, let's go get some drinks. So it hasn't quite sunk in yet. And so I think this is kind of this, it's got to hit a few times. And then, so Lou Elizondo's book, in fact, I read the first few chapters already. The full book hasn't come out. It's going to be a wild book, I'll tell you that.
What's it called?
It's called Imminent.
Oh, the Imminent book. Okay.
Yeah. And so, but then that's going to trigger these documentaries, other people. And then I believe the coup de grace will be coming sometime this year with someone that everyone would recognize if they watch, if they paid attention to the news, you would know this person.
Wild.
So we'll see. But then that puts us in this. So I think all these things are going to come together, right? It's like, right now, the way that kind of the consensus, national security, geopolitical community thinks about risk is like, okay, China, known risk, got to quantify that. The next few years, there's this acute tail risk event, but then also a structural rise in these tensions. We got to manage a more geopolitically volatile environment. Then we have now this new thing, AI, and the prospect of potentially disruptions from, artificial general intelligence systems that could become, strategic to both national defense as well as economic security and overall economic development and destabilizing our basic sort of division of labor in society. Okay, that's a new problem we have to figure out, and that's kind of risen kind of maybe equal to the China problem in terms of the policy priority. We talked about Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin being kind of this, and again, this emergent phenomenon that potentially is another exponential that is going from being outside the Overton window to firmly inside the Overton window. And that will start to, have other cascading effects on our geopolitical dynamics we were just talking about. But again, like in the rank of like how serious the policy discourse treats that subject, it's like pretty far below right now, China and AI. And then the UAP one, the median, geopolitical consultant or policy blob person who goes on, different panels to talk about these issues, this isn't even in the Overton window. It's like a fringe thing. Doesn't seem like a serious topic. It's sort of, chuckled at nervously. And I actually think maybe the order, like the sequence should be like inverted, realistically, right? Like you could face a scenario the next 12 months where UAPs the topic of UAPs do become, on the par with the China and AGI discourse, and Bitcoin maybe jumps to that level as well if Trump wins, for example, and goes all in. So I think people are not prepared for a 2025 scenario where all of a sudden these things start to creep in from the edges, and then that's why I think people trying to plan for 2035 or 2040 are just like, don't bother, right? Like, it's like, you just got to get through the next 12, 24 months. And yeah, keep your head on a swivel.
Can we go get a beer?
Yes.
Let's be done. Oh, Matthew Pines. Fuck me, that was incredible. Appreciate you. I mean, I have so many more questions, but there's no point. We've done like 2.5 hours. We'll be here all day. Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.